Hello, my awesome students. It's Dr. Foltz. Today, we're going to take a look at August Wilson's Fences. And specifically, we're going to look at the names and how the names of the characters are both symbolic, but also they're reflective of the different characters' identities. We're going to look at 7 characters, which really is all the characters within the play. We're going to look at Troy, Rose, Lyons, Cory, Bono, Gabriel, and then last but not least, Raynell. And if you notice what I have here, I have Troy's first and last name. And the reason why I'm doing this is because both his first name and his last name have symbolic importance. So let's take a look at Troy first, and let's look at his first name first. So when we think about the word Troy, probably what comes to most people's minds, if I said, what do you think about? They'll think about the city of Troy from the so-called Trojan War. And because that is what it's making a reference to, this name is representative of the concept of being strong, of being resilient. And the reason for that is because when we think about Troy and we think about the stories with it, it resisted the siege of about 10 years. I mean, didn't fully resist it because, of course, eventually it was broken into with the so-called Trojan horse led by Odysseus. But it resisted for 10 years. And so to do that, to resist against all those different so-called heroes such as Odysseus and Achilles, that shows a lot of strength and perseverance and resilience. And the reason why it's appropriate for Troy is because when we think about everything they went through, regardless of how we think about him as a character, as a human being, rather, the reality is he did really have to be a pretty strong guy to resist and to overcome what he did overcome. Doesn't mean that he's perfect, doesn't mean that he didn't make mistakes, horrible mistakes. However, the reality is that he faced some pretty tough things and he was able to overcome it. Let's now take a look at his last name. His last name is a blending of 2 words. Well, first, the last name is Maxim, but it's a blending of 2 words, Mason and Dixon. And Mason and Dixon, obviously, when we think about this, if you're familiar with the United States history, what should pop into your mind is the so-called Mason-Dixon line. What is the Mason-Dixon line? Well, I let the Oxford Dictionary define it for us. The Mason-Dixon line was sort of this imaginary line, this line of demarcation that separated the so-called slave-owning states from the non-slave owning states, if you will. And so, as the Oxford Dictionary says, the slave owning states before the abolition of slavery. Now, when we think about the abolition of slavery, a lot of us might think that it's 1863 with the Emancipation Proclamation, but we know, of course, that slavery wasn't truly abolished, if you will, with the United States until after the Civil War, because the Emancipation Proclamation only abolished slavery within the South. It did not abolish slavery within the so-called border states. But regardless of that, even though this is making a reference to the Mason-Dixon line, it's not making a reference to slavery per se. What it's making a reference to is segregation, because the setting of the novel takes place, of the play takes place in the 1950s and then into the early mid-1960s or so. This is important. The reason why it's important was because it takes place just after segregation. And in the United States history, segregation began with Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, and it was finally legally abolished. That doesn't mean that segregation didn't exist, but it was legally abolished in 1954 with the Brown versus Board of Education case. Why is this important? Well, the reason why this is important, the reason why Troy has that last name is because he's got one foot in the time frame in which segregation was legally allowed, and then he's got another foot in when segregation was abolished. And as a result, he is sort of split. He's a split between this disillusionment and hope. He's got the split within him in terms of he doesn't quite trust the system by any means. Because remember, he was supposedly this great baseball player. He never got an opportunity to play within the major leagues. He could only play in the Negro leagues. He was fighting a variety of other acts of racism against him, ranging from his inability to get a loan to his inability to, well, he had to fight. He eventually got it, but his inability initially to get a job, the same type of job that a white man had, which was driving the garbage truck. And so this maxim demonstrates this split within him, not just in terms of his life being split, in terms of him living before and after the time of segregation, because obviously Rose did the same thing as well as other characters. But for him, there's this sort of duality with him where one, he's disillusioned. And so it's this disillusionment versus hope. But there's other ways in which he's split too. So I've written a couple of them down. One of them talks about the lies versus the truth, and that's sort of emulated within the stories that he tells. But also this idea of the hate versus love, or this anger they has versus love. So to give an example of where he's sort of this dual nature here, He is not allowing Cory, of course, to become a football player or to attend college. And the reason why he's not allowing Cory to do so is because he's disillusioned with the system. He doesn't think that Cory will have an opportunity to actually play or make something of himself if he pursues this football or if he pursues college, if you will. Now, Cory wrongly says that the only reason why Troy doesn't want him to play football is because Cory, or rather, is because Troy is afraid that Cory will be better than him. And that's not really the case here. Really, what Troy is afraid of is that Cory will be just like him, that he will have this life in which he will not have these opportunities. If you remember, one thing that Troy stresses to Cory to do again and again and again is to get a job, to have money in his pocket, to take care of himself. It's very sort of Booker T. Washington mentality. And again, the reason why is because he is disillusioned with the system. He doesn't think that Cory will truly get an opportunity in the same way that he didn't get that opportunity. And so by him not allowing Cory to play football, by him making Cory work, by him doing all these different things to him, even though they're cruel on a variety of levels, this is the way that Troy expresses his love to Cory. And so this is what I mean when I say there's this duality within him, this conflict within him of love versus hate. He is treating Cory in many ways in a very hateful way. Obviously, it's sort of the climatic moment of the fight, the conflict between the two of them. But the reason why he's doing these things, in his mind, it's out of love. It's because he loves Cory, even though he won't come out and say it. The way Troy says, "I love you" to Cory is by not signing the papers. By the way, Troy says, "I love you" to Cory is by saying, "You will not play football. You're going to get a job because that's the best way to protect yourself, and that's the best way that you won't become like me." Again, it doesn't excuse his behavior, but this is that duality within him and that maxim, if you will, within him. Next character that we're going to talk about is Rose, and I think Rose is sort of the most obvious, if you will, of all the characters to understand what her name means. When we think about Rose, we think about the flower, of course. And within literature, that word rose, or a flower specifically, it really is represented to this idea of the eternal and timeless love. And we see that with Rose. And what I mean by that is that Rose never, ever doesn't show love to people. Like, even when Troy does awful, awful things to her with Alberta, among other things, she still is with him. She still lets him stay within that house there. Granted, her choices are limited because of the time frame which we're living in here, but nonetheless, she's still demonstrating acts of love towards him. So that's one example with regards to Troy of that continuous and eternal love, if you will. But also to the children, we can understand why she would show, this eternal love for Cory because it's her own child. But look the way she treats Lyons. Look at the way she treats Raynell. Raynell, of course, being the child of what we'll say, a salacious relationship between Alberta as well as Troy. But yet she treats Raynell as if the child is her own. And then, of course, the way she treats Gabe. Notice also with all those characters, exception being Raynell here, and we can include Bono in this too, anytime they're at the house, she's always offering them food. And this is one of the ways in which she expresses her love to these characters. In addition to that, Rose comes out and even compares herself to a rose. If you recall the moment in which Troy breaks the news and says, "Look, I've been cheating on you, and she's pregnant. I'm going to be a father." And then he starts talking about the reason why he cheats on her. And he says, in essence, that there's something in me that was still hungry. There's something in me that was still not whole. And Alberta was sort of filling it for me. Awful, awful thing to say to Rose, but nonetheless, that's what he says. And Rose, in essence, says, "Hey, I felt the same way." And then she literally compares herself to this flower. And I have the dialogue up on here. She says, "I took all my feelings, my wants and my needs, my dreams, and I buried them inside you." So we get this metaphorical language of the seed being buried. "And I planted myself inside you and waited to bloom. And it didn't take me no 18 years to find out that the soil was hard and rocky and it wasn't never going to bloom." Now, there's two levels to this. There's the one that I talked about in terms of being the rose and the plant. So that's that metaphor here. But then there's another level here, and it's a very biblical one, which we won't get too much into, where she's comparing herself in the very biblical fashion, because the Bible talks about, when it comes to faith, among other things, there's two types of soils that you can plant faith into. One type is that very fertile, rich soil where the seed will grow very easily. And then there's the other type, and this is sort of Troy, where it's very hard for it to grow because it's rocky soil here. And so, nonetheless, we have this Rose character, and her name is very, very appropriate for her. Next character is Lyons. Lyons is pretty self-explanatory too. Lyons is the so-called king of the jungle. Gabe even calls him the king of the jungle. And the reason why he's the king of the jungle, the reason why he's named Lyons, is because he shows this sort of level of courage that honestly Troy doesn't show. Nor do any of the other characters, with the exception, of course, of Cory. And what is the courage that he shows? What's the strength that he shows as the king of the jungle? Well, he pursues his dream. And his dream, of course, is to be a musician. Now, it doesn't matter that he doesn't really fulfill his dream. It doesn't matter that he continues the cycle that his father started. And what I mean by that, he continues that cycle because he ends up a criminal. Remember, he ends up serving time. I believe it's 3 years that he ends up serving. So he doesn't break the cycle, but yet he does continue to try to make manifest that dream in his own life there. Our other character is Cory. Cory, you had to do just a little bit of research to understand what his name means. When we look at the word Cory and we look it up, we realize that the root of it, core, means heart. And so that's sort of self-explanatory as to why he's named Cory now, because he's sort of the emotional center of the play, for good or for bad, for not just for Troy, but obviously for Troy, for Rose, as well as those peripheral characters, because they're seeing what's going on here. Now, in the same way that Lyons has the heart or the courage, if you will, to pursue his dreams, so does Cory. And like Lyons, he's not successful, of course. Troy is the one who sort of stops him, he impedes him, he doesn't sign the papers, also he throws him out. And we know as a result of that, Cory ends up going into the military. But nonetheless, he's got this willingness to pursue his dreams. He's got the heart to follow it. Our next character is Bono. He's the one character who's outside the family that deserves conversation. Now, the word Bono, if we look that up again, also we're going to see that it's derived from Latin, which means good. We know in Spanish, Bono means good also. So why is he good? Well, he's good in a variety of levels. One, he's loyal. He's loyal not just to Troy, but to the family. Now, to Troy specifically, he tries to serve as the good moral center, if you will, for Troy. He almost serves as a moral compass for Troy. Because remember, since the very beginning of the play, in scene 1, he's constantly talking to Troy and he's asking, what about Alberta? What are you doing? Don't mess things up for Rose. Do the right thing, etc., etc. And unfortunately, Troy doesn't listen to him, or maybe it's too late for him to listen to him. But regardless, Bono does his best to sort of keep Troy on that straight and narrow road. He fails, of course. We have, speaking about straight and narrow roads, and we mentioned sort of the biblical connection with Rose and the rocky soil. We have Gabriel, also known as simply as Gabe. Easily the most symbolic or the most metaphorical of the characters. The name Gabriel is that of an archangel. He doesn't even try to dissuade us from thinking about that. And nor, of course, does August Wilson. Gabriel talks about seeing the book of life. He talks about fighting the hellhounds, I believe it is. He walks around with his trumpet. So there's lots of godliness and divine sort of aura, if you will, with Gabe. The reason why he's really, really important to the book, or rather the story, he does two things for us. One, he lets you know as an audience member that Troy is a good person. And you're going to struggle with that because you're going to see how awful he treats Cory, of course, how awful he treats Rose, how awful he treats Lyons. And he's got so many missteps. It's just, we lose count of them. But yet Gabe tells us very early in the play that he saw Troy's name in the book of life. And again, one of the reasons why we know that Troy's name is in the book of life, because even though his actions are destructive, they're almost tragic, if you will, his actions are done out of love. He does these destructive things to Cory. He does these destructive things to Lyons because he doesn't want them to end up like himself. And honestly, with Lyons, he keeps telling Lyons, hey, you got to do this. You got to stay out of those bars. You got to do these different things. And Lyons keeps saying, I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm fine. But unfortunately, Lyons does end up following in those footsteps of Troy. So this is one of the reasons why Gabriel announces to us that he's in his book of life, because Troy should be perceived as, well, a flawed human being, a good human being that deserves our kindness and our empathy and our understanding. He doesn't not deserve the consequences to his actions. Don't get me wrong there. But what he deserves is a little bit more of an open ear, a little bit more of an understanding ear. And one of the reasons why, of course, he deserves that too, is because of systemic racism that he's been facing, this institutionalized racism that he's been facing for all of his life. Again, doesn't excuse actions that he's taken, but we can understand a little bit better why he takes those actions. So Gabriel sort of helps us with that. And what Gabriel also does at the end of the play, he helps to bring reconciliation to this Maxim family. So let's go back to the name Maxim. We have Mason Dixon, we have this line, and we talk about how it's a duality or this dividing line within Troy himself, but it's also a dividing line within the Maxim family, specifically between Troy and everybody else. And Gabe helps to bring them together, certainly at the end when he blows his trumpet and the heavens split open and everyone watch and sort of oohs and ahs, if you will. And he says something to the effect of, then that's the end. That's all I have to say about that. That's the end of that. And so what Gabe also is, he's sort of the example of grace. And when we think about grace, think about it in the godly form, this idea where it is this form of love, that's divine love, in which you give with you expect nothing in return. And that's what Gabriel is. And then our final character is Raynell. And Raynell, at least the first half of the name is pretty sort of simple and obvious to us. When we think about the word ray, we think about this ray of light. And when we think about light, one way that we can think about is the idea of hope, or maybe even this new beginning. And this ties in nicely to what Rose says near the end here about Raynell. She talks about when she saw that baby, when she saw him, when Troy brought him in, she basically said that all these other hopes and dreams that she had, and which she tried to fulfill earlier. We're talking about Rose. She tried to fulfill her hopes and dreams through the lottery, which, of course, Troy shot down, kind of rightfully so, if you will, where he said that even though it was harmless sort of hope that she had to win this money, the reality is it probably wasn't going to take place. But she talked about, back to Rose, she talked about how that when she saw this baby, it was sort of this manifestation of all the hopes that she ever had, all the things that she ever wanted, and there this child was. And so what it also gives for Rose is a new beginning, and it kind of kickstarts the family again. Not necessarily in a positive way, because of course it splits Rose and Troy apart irreparably. But what it does, it gives Rose a sort of new beginning herself. This new beginning, not just in terms of focusing on the child, but if you notice at the end of the play, she's sort of her own person finally, where she's not completely doting on Troy. Let's take a look at the second part of the name. The second part of the name, it's derived from the word Helen, or the name Helen. So it's derived from other names too, but Helen is one that we should be aware of. And the reason why we should be aware of that is because when we think about Troy, or the so-called Trojan War, we think about what started the Trojan War. It's more complex than this, but the person whose name is most identified with starting the Trojan War is Helen, or the so-called Helen of Troy, or the so-called, quote unquote, the face that launched 1,000 ships. And so what is the thing that finally really creates this conflict that ends up destroying Troy or ending Troy here? Well, it's Helen, right? Or Raynell here. The other thing to think about is that the word Helen, when we look that up, it literally means torch or light. And so now we have ray. So a ray of what? A ray of light. And so now the name is fully complete there. So that's it, my awesome students. Those are the 7 names and a brief breakdown of each of them. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments section, or feel free to send me an email, which is available on the YouTube page. And then as always, please leave a like and subscribe. I hope you have a great day. Goodbye now.